Wildcat. It's Maximus here, this time with a review of the Milwaukee 6067, excuse me, the last of the American-made big 7/9-inch 15 amp 5000 RPM grinders. So these 15 amp 9-inch grinders are about the biggest portable electric grinders you can find. There are some specific really high power models, 7 inches and 9 inches, that go up to 20 amps. DeWalt had a few models in Milwaukee. I don't think either of the manufacturers have any current models that are the 20 amp super power units. Mainly because these 5000 RPM 15 amp units pretty much will do everything that you need. They are super duty, and these are the big commercial grinder that Milwaukee had before they went to the new style. And when they did, they started being made in China. The Milwaukee grinder is pretty decent, but I don't think it's quite as good as the Black Decker Wildcats. Grunting for a reason, because this Wildcat I actually have a 9-inch masonry grinding wheel with the steel guard, plus it's already heavier as a base. These are the standard grinder, or the, let me zoom out just a little bit here. These would be the essentially the industry standard, or what you would compare it to. All manufacturers have products that aren't so great, and then have products that really were just some of the best in the business. And when it comes to these Wildcat grinders, that was really the case. Black & Decker stopped making these around the time that Milwaukee transitioned to the cheaper body style. You know, more streamlined, but it just isn't as robust as these older Milwaukees, and these older Milwaukees weren't as robust as the Wildcats. Some of the big differences between these two grinders is, one, you know, on this they have the plastic abrasion, or the plastic guard, so when you're using it, you set it down, or when you're done using it, you'd set it down on its back. Black & Decker actually used to do that, and now they transition to all metal because it ends up holding up better. I've seen a lot of these old Milwaukees at like pawn shops, well, this plastic cover ends up getting really beat up and even starts breaking apart, so that isn't so great. Things like the vent cover, even on the USA made one, plastic. It's steel over here on the Wildcat. Ergonomics not as good. Milwaukee uses the same trigger as a skill saw, so I'm not going to open up the handle, but I will pull out the gear in the front just so we can take a look at the gears, and I'll open up this cover so I can get a better look at the motor. But since they use that style of trigger switch where it needs to be overrated, and on these Milwaukees it is a 20 amp, not a 22 like the skill saw, but still pretty good. They just have this leverage ratio, because when you want to have contacts that stout, you need stout springs, which means that you need a pretty stiff trigger. So that is an unfortunate situation, as you will get finger fatigue and will be switching fingers. They do have a trigger lock, and I do like how it's really well recessed, so you're not going to be hitting that accidentally, but they have to make it kind of hard to hit. Where on the Timberwolf here, and the reason I'm doing these comparisons is like, what, you know, this is a great grinder, but you know, it really is a great grinder. Black & Decker uses a totally different switch design. That's what this whole bulbous thing here is the whole switch mechanism is here. So the actual trigger has a much greater leverage ratio on a massive switch. So it's a high power switch that's really easy to use. Getting the switch out of the handle means that you have top-notch ergonomics. This handle is as good as it gets, because all it has is a wire going through it, so they can make it just the absolute perfect shape instead of being bulkier and more square. I never liked that. Milwaukee was always about these squarish handles, and the sharper rounded edges end up just biting into your hands if you have to use it for any significant period of time compared to one of these. It also affords them the ease of having just a really nice, easy to use trigger lock, but it's way up here, so you just don't have any chance of accidentally hitting it. Other differences include the spindle lock on the Wildcat is down here, so when you're working with the wheel, you can press in the spindle lock nice and easy and use your wrench to loosen up the wheel. On the Milwaukee, it's on top. So when you have your wrench, it's not too bad, but you got to fiddle with it, and it's essentially underneath the tool in this situation, instead of just being right there and a little easier to hit. And then, of course, the next thing to point out is this. That is the funky system that Milwaukee used to mount a guard. Many of them, of these models, you could save a few bucks and order it without a guard if you're going to use it for sanding. Many times these are called angle sanders rather than just grinders, because many times you'll be using one of these heavy tools really on boats and all sorts of surface refinishing, and sanding, you have a large area of contact, so you actually need a lot of power, and that's what these were for. And then the weight of the tool is what did the work, so you weren't ever actually pressing. Although many of these grinders have been used by all sorts of industries, pipeline welders. I had comments in my old simple review of these Wildcats of people using them overhead, and if you were somebody who could work all day with one of these grinders, either one of these overhead, then I mean, you're Hercules, really. I mean, you got to have some huge shoulders and arms. That's all I'm saying. Somebody said that they did that, and they must be a huge individual. So the guard system has like this weird plate that you put on the guard, and then it screws in. It just really isn't super robust. It was always a disappointment, and it was a disappointment that Milwaukee had a bunch sold these, or you had to kind of get the special package that came with the guard, and so it was like just a bit cheesy on Milwaukee's part. They really were just being disappointing and not quite delivering the way I thought they should have. They have so many good power tool products, but this isn't one of them. We're on the Black & Decker. It's what you would expect. It's just a nice round bung, many different grinders. This would be the standard where it's just a machined area, so you can clamp it on, and you can see their steel guard here actually uses bolts. It just bolts on and is super secure. It also weighs like 3 pounds, adds another 3 pounds of steel. But I've met people who have lost their eyes due to grinding wheels exploding. So I run guards when I run grinders, grinding wheels. But when you're running sanding, then or using it for buffing, then you don't need the guard. And the very last of this comparison is the fact that, like many tools, grinders, polishers, that type of thing, rotary hammers, masonry drills, will do this. See, this has no vent on the left-hand side. Most people are right-handed, so as you're using this, it's to prevent you getting a bunch of particles blown in your face. But of course, if you're left-handed, it doesn't do you any good, because then you just have the remaining vents blowing in your face. Or on the Wildcat, it has this steel redirector so that all the air goes forwards, and so it isn't hitting you in the face regardless of whether you're left or right-handed. So when you're really comparing what seems like an awesome product to what really is really good industrial duty, you can see that there's quite a bit of difference. I mean, the gearbox on this is one cast piece, and how they build it, they put in the big gear and then they press the arbor through the gear while it's in the gearbox. And that's one of the reasons they have this hole, is not only can you replace that bearing, you actually have to press it, the whole spindle out, before you can remove the gear. Where on the Milwaukee, it's a 3-piece gearbox, or it's a 2-piece gearbox. We have the upper casting, and then we have this lower casting, so it makes it easier to assemble. But the problem with that is the fact that when you have one casting, when you machine it, it maintains a higher degree of precision in the bearings, and that bearing life is dictated by loads, the accuracy of the manufacture of the bearing itself, and how well aligned they are when they're under operation. A ball bearing in a power tool can last twice as long as if it has a super precision alignment and is just running perfectly on center than the very same bearing with just a little bit of machining defect, so it's tilted or it's getting too much pressure on it. And of course, there's ABEC grades, ABEC 3, ABEC 5, ABEC 7. That's how precision, how round the balls are, how smooth and round the tracks of a ball bearing are. Just increasing the grade of a steel ball bearing from ABEC 5 to ABEC 7 can increase its life by 50%. There's really a lot of science behind bearings. Let me give this a quick run. We'll take a quick look at its gears. It is still a beast. I mean, any way you cut it, it's a 5,000 RPM, 15 amp grinder. And I don't have a wheel on it, otherwise we'd really hear that torque sound of the motor. So I'll take a quick peek at some of the build quality of this. I don't think I ever did that with the Wildcat. So these Milwaukees are at least still new enough to where they started getting maybe a little bit cheapified, but I don't think it'll be too bad. One thing you want to do if you're ever buying used tools like this, if you're pulling out the brushes, it doesn't really matter what side they go on. What does matter, particularly on a tool like a grinder where grinders run in only one direction, is the brushes will wear in that one direction. So you'll want to make sure that they maintain their alignment. And for some reason, I've seen this also in the Black & Decker, since grinders are under much higher load than even saws, that they do this where they have split brushes. That way they can put in two wires and actually, decrease the resistance and significantly increase the current handling capability. And if you look at brushes and they have the wires have a nice copper color, they obviously have not been overheated. One of the ways you can tell if you forgot which way they go up is as the motor's spinning. In this case, the motor's spinning this direction, so it kind of drags the brush up and will cause wear on one side as it's kind of being pushed up versus wear on the other side. You can also sometimes just take a look at the brush itself and there'll be a little bit of evidence, but on this one it's much easier to see like that. But this is something that's pretty rare, and it is an upgrade on saws and some other tools, is actually ordering these brushes and then putting them in your chop saw or whatever, and you can get just a little bit more power out of it. But it's always nice to see, and it has a pretty decent brush holder. Let me put that back. We'll just take a quick look at the motor through this convenient window instead of having to completely just pull apart the whole front case and all that. Because of the grit and because grinders really do like to be have good alignment, it really does make a difference in the particular life of a grinder and the life of the gears, because they're all matched up. I generally try not to take apart at least a front case unless you really have some rags handy or ready to make sure it's particularly clean. Never liked that they had this plastic cover. These used to be metal on the Milwaukees. I got a flashlight here, so we'll take a closer look at this. Whoop. Let's see if I can't get... Oh, I can. Let me get some zoom here. There we go. So you can actually get a pretty decent idea that they didn't put a whole lot of protection on the motor. It is a really nice commutator. It's a one solid blocks, or not block, but individual blocks of copper that they machine down. Then they have these large bosses on the ends, and that's where they use a electric current and essentially arc weld the motor wires into the commutator. So that is pretty solid. But it would be nice if they just had some more protection. There is no wrapping on that winding where before they put the acrylic lacquer on it, they put a bunch of string around the wires just to help prevent them from fatiguing and then debris from impacting the intake side of the motor. But in more recent tools, they've really discovered that just isn't necessary. That isn't just a big enough failure mode for tools before they, that isn't what the primary cause of them failing is. And especially on a 15 amp tool, there are some pretty hefty wires in there. One thing they did do, which I find interesting, at least it's nice, I don't know if you can see in the camera. Yeah, you can. You can see that green. That's the field winding. They did do a heavy epoxy dip on the field winding, so that is pretty nice. Probably because on grinders there's enough vibration that you'll actually get abrasion between the windings of the field, causing it to not fail, but it'll have start losing power and generating more heat. And you'll have a grinder that always seems to be underpowered and just gets really hot when you use it. It can be that some of the windings have just rubbed against each other, even though they may lacquer them, like some companies may lacquer them lightly, like it's a power drill. But in the grinder, there's enough vibration, and it's enough high energy vibration, high frequency, where the thin insulation, it'll just rub through each other until a couple of the windings short out, and it ends up just being, once that starts happening, it gets worse and worse. And so I can see why Milwaukee really went a little heavy duty on the protection for the field windings. Let's take a look at the gears and we'll finish up with this. Whoop. So this was super easy to get off, which is surprising on this Milwaukee. No kind of gasket or seal, which would have been nice to see, but they are using a very premium molybdenum grease. We can see that this is a huge, that's probably a 3.5 inch diameter bevel gear right there. The bearing's really tight. A little bit of wobble because it's not supported on the other end, but this way because it's a ball bearing. As far as in and out, no play whatsoever. Interesting little key. Well, it turns out, let me get this. It actually turns out that this is essentially omnidirectional. Meaning, if for some reason you didn't like the whole pattern for the guard being this way, you can turn the gearbox the other direction. Here's the other side of the gearbox. So one of the reasons that these two pieces are also, not as nice as a one piece is because you have 4 more screws and just another place for it to get loose. This is the little key, and it just has 2 flats and it goes over the spindle. I suppose in consideration, that's actually not a bad idea, because if for some reason you hit the button while the grinder's running, it will both damage this as well as damage the switch. But at least this thing would be super easy to replace. And then let me get a flashlight here, because I always need a flashlight. I wish I need like stadium lights to see. We can see a really nice large needle bearing down in there. That is an uncaged needle bearing. So there's like 20 little needles all just packed in next to each other. Really nice heavy duty grease. I'm hitting my camera. And then there's our input bevel gear. Once again, a nice thick teeth. Those are probably 1/8 of an inch thick at the top of the flap. Probably getting towards 3/16 down at the root of the tooth. So very thick teeth. Super wide, so it definitely has sufficient gears and big enough teeth to be a heavy duty grinder. It's a good grinder. It just may not be the best. And I think these are built better than their current versions. Anyway, this grease is still totally great in this grinder. I'm going to add just a bit just to help it out since I have it open. But that's essentially my cringy review. Anyway, this was kind of a longer video, but it's always interesting to take a look in some of these tools and take a quick peek at, what they chose to do in their engineering for professional grade tools. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.